Should we get into goddesses?
Yes, let's do the whole thing about goddesses, because that is a very, very interesting topic. As we've neglected to say,
we've neglected for 115 episodes.
Yes, as we have been neglecting it for a pretty long time at this point. Yes. Okay. So what is the first thing you'd like to know about goddesses, Dan?
What constitutes as a goddess?
That's a really good question. Okay, so actually that's a really good place to start, because I don't know if a lot of people know this, but in the Germanic languages, and English is actually a Germanic language, even though some people are like, oh, is it? Yeah, it is. Just the whole basis for English is Germanic. And you got a bunch of like French influence and Latin and so on, but it's still a Germanic language. And the interesting thing is that in English and all the other Germanic languages, the word God used to be a neutral word.
Okay.
It was not a gendered male originally, and this also means then that we didn't have, you know, a female version of a god either. So if you dig into the etymology of the word itself, then it looks like it meant something like something that is addressed, something that you call upon, or yeah, you know, communicate with in some kind of religious context. So that means that anything could be a god, essentially, if it's just religiously charged, right? And it also means that it doesn't matter. Like you, for instance.
We are starting a bit of a cult over in the Discord, so
yes,
maybe I'm going to ascend.
You have to have gold-plated balls to be a god, just so you know.
You've not seen my balls.
No, but I know that there are several Mexican gang members over the years who have died trying to gold plate their balls. So
really,
yes, it's a thing. I don't know why it's a thing, but it's a thing, man.
I mean, why is it not a thing? Of course, it's a thing.
How can you gold plate balls? It doesn't work, man.
Hey.
Great. By the way, we're talking about goddesses, and we've already, you know, diverted ourselves to balls. So, okay, going back to the subject at hand. The word itself did not distinguish between male or female in that regard. So that means that the word could, for instance, the Old Norse "goð," could be used about all of them. Now, so that's really important to consider, because it also means that we can't necessarily expect the same sort of like gender connotations that we today would associate with mythologies and religions and so on to have been present back then. Of course, there were very similar gender connotations, though, in some cases at least. But it's just important to consider that we can't expect it. Right? We can expect that people perhaps had multiple ways of thinking about these things in different ways. Okay.
So how do we know who's male and who's female then, if the same word applies to both?
Well, I mean, so fortunately or unfortunately, depending on how you approach the topic, the mythology that we have written down is written down in that firmly Christianized context where God is a male. And so we see Snorri Sturluson, for instance, distinguishing between Aesir as the male gods and Ausinir as the female deities. Right?
Okay.
Now, it's not clear that actually was a distinction that existed prior to medieval Iceland. It could have been, it actually kind of looks like Snorri Sturluson might have invented that fucking distinction. So that's also important to consider, that if you asked a Viking about the Aesir, that Viking might not have distinguished between a male and a female Aus if you ask that question. Who are they? What are they? And so on. We don't know if a Viking would have thought, oh well, the Aesir are male, and then there are the Ausinir. That could just as well just be Snorri Sturluson who's inventing that little bit. So that's really important to consider. All right. So what are the earliest evidence of goddesses in this whole mythology? Well, the earliest archaeological material that we have is on the Matronae from the Rhineland, and like that whole area that goes from, which is the parts that are now eastern France and western Germany, all the way up along the Rhine through the Netherlands, and that whole area. That's where you see a lot of goddess worship in the first couple of centuries CE. And what we can see is that this is a mix of Celtic, Roman, and Germanic goddess cults that are being generated there. And we can see a slow and steady trickle of related cultic activity, we could call it that, into Scandinavia from that area. And we have the Roman historian Tacitus, who writes about goddess worship in a quote unquote an island up in the Northern Ocean, and that is probably somewhere in Denmark. He talks about a goddess named Nerthus, who's being transported around in a wagon during certain times of the year, and kept in a temple by a lake at other times of the year. And what we have from that same time period when Tacitus is writing, we have a bunch of wagons that have been deposited in bogs and lakes in the Danish area. So far 6 of them have been found. So it actually kind of seems like he's talking about some kind of cult that is actually leaving archaeological remains in that time period when he's talking about it. And of course we have a bunch of depictions of females in various forms on archaeological material from that time period and onwards. So we know that they're worshiping goddesses in Scandinavia in that time. Does
it seem like it's more like individual cults rather than a wide range of worshipping goddesses? Does it seem like, I guess, like for the most part, people would worship the gods, like the male figures, and then like you'd have sects or little like cults that would go towards the females, or is that not an issue or a thing?
I don't think so. I think it looks like there is a relatively even distribution of people's religious interests in various deities.
Okay.
Like,
do you see male cults in the same way that you mentioned with the female one? Do you see that as well, like kind of little sects where they choose one god or one deity to
the thing is that we don't have when it comes to like Scandinavia in the centuries after Tacitus, we don't have, and this goes for all religion essentially, all religious practices. We don't have a very good picture of like a distinct cults for anything, really.
Okay.
Like what we have is like scattered evidence that looks like a smoking gun, so to speak, or maybe the smoke from the fire, or however you want to say. So for instance, we have like temples that we have like archaeologically uncovered in many places in Scandinavia. Now, archaeologists don't like to call it temples because of some random ass debates that happened in the early 20th century, but they are temples. That's just what they are. And archaeologists would like for me to call them cult houses instead, just so you know. But they're fucking temples, okay?
What's the difference?
The difference is like nitpicking terminology, because if you say temple and people are thinking like maybe something like Roman with like stone columns and all that stuff, and that's not exactly what we have. But then on the other hand, because like one of the things that archaeologists will be pointing out is that, well, these locations where we can see distinct religious and cultic activity, they are also used for other things. And it's like, yeah, sure. And then the archaeologists like, so let's call them cult houses instead of temples. But on the other hand, the temples in Rome and Greece and elsewhere, they were also used for other things than distinct religious activities. So is it really that big of a difference? Anyway, it doesn't really matter.
No,
I
it's
call them
not.
temples.
A temple is just, it's different depending on where you are in the world, what religion. They're all completely different. I mean, yeah. I'm sure there's some temples over here in England where people go and play football in the afternoon.
Like, I am sure.
They're multi-purpose. Like they get used for a bunch of different things.
Yes. Oh, I'm sure you're right about that. So
I know I'm right about it. I've played football in them.
Okay. Well, there you are. All right. So these temple sites, for instance, they show evidence of various, what we would call in the lingo of the field, cultic activity. And a lot of it seems sort of like cast, at least when we get to the 500s and onwards, a lot of it seems cast in sort of a, if you could call it quote unquote male image, in the sense that a lot of the items that are found, they carry images of men on them, or things that have to do with war or warriorhood or the status of a man of some kind. So there seems to be a shift too, where from the 500s and onwards, religious activity pivots more towards the activities of not just men, but more specifically the ruling warrior elites, right? So you have a development in society where everything becomes more and more structured around warrior elites. And this is what is essentially the Viking Age. The Viking Age is kind of defined by the fact that we have societies in Scandinavia that are dominated by a warrior elite, which might not have been the case before the 500s. What we might have seen before the 500s are more things like tribal councils, perhaps. This is me just like suggesting, because we have very, very little evidence for how these societies were actually structured back then. But we can see a shift towards a warrior elite that starts governing society after 500. So we have to ask ourselves, well, what is the alternative that was in place before that is not leaving the same kind of evidence in archaeology, right? And this is not to like make this like lame distinction that you get with Gimbutas, this 1950s archaeologist, like, oh, there used to be matriarchal societies and now there are patriarchal societies because la 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 la. No, that's not how it works. That's never how it worked. We didn't have like some weird golden age in far back in time where it was only matriarchal societies, and then it's pivoted towards a darker age with male societies and patriarchal societies. That's not how history has worked out either. At sometimes you can see perhaps societies that lean more matriarchal, and at other times lean more patriarchal, and sometimes they might go extreme too. That is a possibility. So what I'm just saying is that we get a more patriarchal society from the 500s and onwards, but we don't know what was before the 500s, except we can see evidence of a religious cult that is centered around lakes and bogs and rivers, groves, and a lot of the items that we see sacrificed in those lakes, bogs, rivers, and groves seem to be more goddess aligned in context of what we can read in the later literature, right? So for instance, we see these wagons being put in lakes and bogs in the Danish area in the first couple of centuries CE, and we have the historian Tacitus, who's writing about a goddess in a wagon and so on, and this is all attached to lakes as well.
I imagine a wagon's quite a expensive thing that you're not going to put in a lake without good reason for it. You know, it's
Yes.
usable. It means something. It
Yes.
might sound kind of trivial today, but back
Yeah.
then a wagon was important.
Exactly. And you know, some of them are adorned with like metal brass coatings and those kinds of things, very intricately carved, all those kinds of things. So people put a lot of effort into creating them, right? And
is that
so
kind of like the ones at the ship museum in Oslo?
Yeah,
because those are when you say a wagon, like I think for anybody listening, when you say wagon, I think of like the just planks of wood on the side there with the hay bales in and the two wheels and all. That's kind of like, I imagine what people will think listening to this though.
That's definitely not what it is. You can go to the National Museum in Denmark and you can see some of these wagons that have been uncovered, and they're fucking beautiful, man. They have you know, little heads carved on the sides and all kinds of things going on. So it's a lot more ornate and intricate than that sort of like a frumpy medieval wagon you're describing right there.
That's kind of the thought though. Even that frumpy medieval wagon is still valuable to his people, but like you said, the ones that I saw at the ship museum in Oslo are unbelievably well. They're unbelievable, intricate, detailed. Like it's unbelievable is the only word to think when you see that and kind of look at it and go, how the fuck did somebody make this? And hopefully we'll get Shan to put maybe like a link in the show notes so people can check it out, because it is remarkable. It's not just a wagon.
No, exactly, and that's the analogy I like to make when talking about these wagons and ships, for that matter, that later on I put in the graves in the Viking Age. It's sort of like the same thing as if Jeff Bezos, like he got that huge yacht made in the Netherlands where they had to take down a fucking bridge to be able to sail it out of the harbor. And like it's kind of like the same with like if Jeff Bezos was like, you look guys, I'm gonna die soon, and when I die I want you to chuck me in my yacht and then put a Bentley in the yacht as well, and then a bunch of my gold and some animals and slaves or whatever the fuck he's got. That's what the Vikings did. They sacrificed slaves and put them in them as well.
That sounds like some Elon Musk energy right there.
Well, I feel like it's any of those billionaires' energy.
Probably, yeah.
Then they chuck that in a burial mound, right? That's what it's about, right? That's what that's sort of like the same analogy that is the analogy that we can use here. I think, like if Jeff Bezos wanted to go out that way.
Yeah, so they're not. It's not just some kind of menial thing. Like it's so hard to even describe how intricately carved some of these things are. I still don't understand how they did it. It's beyond words. I remember the first time when I went to the ship museum and just walking around, I felt speechless, and it's overwhelming until you don't realize until you kind of see it in person, and then it's overwhelming. You're like, okay, how did they carve this?
Yeah, man, they were some really, really good craftsmen back then. Holy shit.
And
yeah,
women.
so moving, getting back to the goddesses, right? So what we can see in that time period up until the 500s is this cultic activity in Scandinavia centered around these bogs and lakes and groves, as I mentioned. There's a decent amount of human sacrifice involved as well. So there is something that suggests that these goddesses needed humans. This is why we have all of those very well preserved bog bodies in northern Germany and in the Netherlands and Denmark and so on.
Okay, here's a question. I've got to ask this as it comes into my mind. So do we see a correlation between, if it's like a sacrifice to a male god, would it be a female slave, and vice versa. If it was a female god, would it be a male slave? Is that, or is there any possibility to even know that?
There's nothing that we can sort of like use to really say for sure that is a way that they were thinking, except for one thing, and that is so this, going back to this Nerthus ritual. Nerthus is a goddess who is transported around by, according to Tacitus, a male slave, and we're told at the end of the story that this male slave, quote unquote, is consumed by the bog afterwards. So it sounds like he's being sacrificed.
He's thrown in the bog, man.
Yes, they bogged him.
Let's call the kettle a kettle. He's thrown in the bog. Poor guy.
Yeah. So it does look like that there is some kind of like male-female relationship here, of a female deity and then a male warden of some kind, who is then supposed to join her. I think that might be the logic behind it, that he is joining her in the bog. And this is where it gets really funky, because we do have another story that is a very similar story about a wagon ritual, but this story is written in Iceland in the early 1300s, and it describes a ritual where the god Freyr is transported around in a wagon in like the Swedish hillbilly country. That's always where the Icelanders put paganism in their stories. Like, Swedish hillbillies are the ones who do pagan stuff.